Hello, my name is Eric Andrian. I'll be reading the second half of Part 5 of Resisting Trumpist Reaction and Left Accommodation, Marxist-Humanist Initiatives, Perspectives for 2018. The text contains many references to print and online publications that I'm not going to read out. You can find the references in the print pamphlet version of our Perspectives. That's here, which is available for purchase on MHI's website, or in the PDF version of the Perspectives, which is available for free on our website. Part 5 of Resisting Trumpist Reaction and Left Accommodation is entitled Combating White Nationalism, Lessons from Marx. The second half, which I'll be reading, examines Marx's writings on and activity around Irish independence and the US Civil War. The foremost lesson we draw from this examination is that fighting white nationalism in the tradition of Marx entails the perspectives of solidarizing with the so-called white working class by decisively defeating Trumpism and other far-right forces. Their defeat will help liberate the white working class from the grip of reaction and thereby spur the independent, emancipatory self-development of working people as a whole. Lessons from Marx. Taking the independent movement of workers seriously and literally. And a quote from Karl Marx's Manifesto of the Communist Party: "The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority, in the interest of the immense majority." As we will see, Marx's response to the threat of white nationalism was very different from that of much of the left today. The basic response of the anti-neoliberal left is consonant with its overall orientation, which can be called left first. Its primary concern is to build the left and win victories, elections, campaigns, adherence, power for itself. Accordingly, it regards common people as a constituency to win over in its quest for political power, and it seemingly has no compunction about winning them over by meeting them where they are at. Footnote: for example, in the January the 31st, 2014 Socialist Alternative, Rami Khalil wrote, quote, "Socialist Alternative used what we call the transitional method. We connect with the consciousness of everyday people and meet them where they are at." Thus, the left offers an alternative version of populism that it hopes the authoritarian white nationalist base that supports Trump, Le Pen et al. will find appealing. As one of its most prominent proponents, Canadian political scientist Sam Gindin, put it last December, any attempt to fight the expected direction of the Trump presidency can't start by blaming the white working class for Trump's victory, but must take the frustrations of the white working class seriously and win them to its side. And when polls indicated that as many as 12% of those who voted for the anti-neoliberal left French presidential candidate Jean-Luc Mélenchon in the first round planned to vote for Le Pen in the second, Mélenchon's supporters did not accept that this fact raises troubling questions about the character of his campaign. At least one even had the audacity to argue that it was a mark in Mélenchon's favour, since it showed that his campaign pulled voters away from Le Pen. Footnote. This information was obtained through personal voice Facebook communications. End quote. To be sure, the left-first types do not endorse explicit appeals to white nationalist sentiments. Their words carefully condemn racism, xenophobia, misogyny, etc. The problem is rather that they seek to win over the authoritarian white nationalist base by offering one or another positive program that does not fight the base's authoritarianism, racism, sexism, and xenophobia head on. For instance, Jacobin editor Bhaskar Sunkara recently wrote that, quote, anti-fascist action is a moral and strategic imperative, which should go together with a positive program to contrast with the neoliberal consensus of the centre. For Sankara, the positive and negative come before consciousness without reciprocal contact, as Hegel put it. The negative component, anti-fascist action, is not allowed to contaminate the positive program that can supposedly win people over by meeting them where they are at. This approach is especially dangerous at this moment in history because it normalizes Trumpism. It treats Trumpism not as a threat and abomination that must be eliminated, but as a legitimate rival for the allegiance of the white working class. It seeks to outcompete its rival on the basis of an alternative but comparable positive program. This is also the approach encoded in the Democratic Party's new A Better Deal economic program. The program rails against Wall Street, special interests, lobbyists and large corporations, while literally saying nothing against Trumpism or against xenophobia, racism, sexism, heterosexism, etc. To understand Marx's response to the threat of white nationalism, it is imperative to situate it within his overall political, philosophical orientation, and to recognise how sharply the latter contrasts with the left-first orientation sketched out above. Here are some of the most striking differences. Marx championed and encouraged what he called the independent movement of workers. This is simple enough to understand if one takes it literally, as one should, but a long legacy of substitutionism, the substitution of some other entity for the workers, has made it easy to misunderstand Marx's meaning. For example, Jill Stein's Green Party is construed as an independent movement because it is independent of the explicitly pro-capitalist political parties, and it advocates policies that would supposedly benefit the working class. The championing of such substitutionist independence encourages a further error, creation of false equivalences between pro-capitalist politicians such as Macron and Le Pen or Clinton and Trump. Macron and Le Pen may indeed be equally bad for the electoral prospects of Mélenchon's movement, and Clinton and Trump may indeed be equally bad for the electoral prospects of the Greens. Yet when one takes Marx literally, the question becomes, are they equally bad for the future trajectory of the independent movement of the workers themselves? Marx supported the independent movement of the workers as a necessary means to achieve the goal of overcoming class society and state domination over individuals, not as an end in itself, and certainly not as a means to further the left. From this advantage, support from below for far-right populism is completely retrogressive, notwithstanding its anti-elite and anti-establishment character, because it rivets working people more firmly to class society and the state. As MHI wrote a year ago, we stand for emancipatory self-activity from below. There is no greater obstacle to this than figures such as Trump, who use racism, sexism, etc. to pit working people against one another in order to divide and conquer them and have them fall in behind the great leader who tells them, "I alone can fix it." End quote. Marx's perspective was thoroughly internationalist. He recognized, of course, that solidarity across national borders strengthened working class movements. He also staunchly opposed all forms of nationalism that sought to forge or strengthen working people's identification with the ruling classes. With the ruling classes of their nation, since it is antithetical to their independent emancipatory self-activity. Quote, "The workers have no country. We cannot take from them what they have not got." And quote, "Proletarians of all countries, unite." Largely for the same reasons, the liberation of workers from identification with their ruling classes and international solidarity, Marx opposed and actively fought not only national and racial prejudices and privileges, but also economic and social conditions that divide working people one from another, e.g. into free men versus slaves and natives versus immigrants, and thereby foster these prejudices and privileges. This is a main, if not the main reason why he supported victory for the North in the Civil War, especially once it became an explicit anti-slavery war, and Irish independence from English rule. In other words, the abolition of slavery in the US and in English rule over Ireland were not only good for blacks and Irish people, they were good for white and English working people as well. By weakening their identification with their ruling classes and eliminating privileges that kept them from solidarizing with black and Irish workers, the abolition of slavery and English rule would help put white and English working people on the path of independent self-activity that aims to overcome class society and class rule. The contemporary analogue to this is clearly the perspective of solidarizing with the white working class by decisively defeating Trumpism, white supremacism, etc. Their defeat will help liberate the white working class from the grip of reaction and spur its independent, emancipatory self-development. Marx on Irish independence. In 1867, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the Fenians, rose up in armed struggle to win Ireland's independence from England. Although Marx was sharply critical of their terroristic methods, he, as well as Friedrich Engels and their organisation, the International Working Men's Association, IWMA, later known as the First International, actively supported the struggle and organised unsuccessfully to secure amnesty for Fenian political prisoners. Footnote: after 3 Fenians were executed, Engels remarked, "To my knowledge, the only time that anybody has been executed for a similar matter in a civilized country was a case of the martyred American abolitionist John Brown at Harper's Ferry." But he added that the action of the English government was even less civilized, since the Southerners had at least the decency to treat John Brown as a rebel, whereas here everything is being done to transform a political attempt into a common crime. End of footnote. However, it was not until the end of 1869 and the start of 1870 that Marx worked out a forceful theoretical position in favour of Irish independence. He developed this position in private communications and in official documents of the IWMA, which adopted and worked to carry out his perspective. English workers' own social emancipation. His principal reason for supporting Irish independence was not humanitarian. He was instead seeking to stimulate the independent, emancipatory self-development of the working class, especially the English working class. In a November 29, 1869 letter to Ludwig Kugelmann, Marx stressed that his aim was not merely to speak out loudly and decisively for the oppressed Irish against their oppressors. He wanted the English working class to fight for the independence of Ireland, not as a matter of sympathy with Ireland, but as a demand made in the interest of the English proletariat. Similarly, in a December 10, 1869 letter to Engels, Marx wrote that while support for international and humane justice for Ireland should be taken for granted, there was an additional reason that Irish independence was important. Quote, "It is in the direct and absolute interest of the English working class to get rid of their present connection with Ireland." 3 weeks later, on January 1st, 1870, a confidential communication from IWMA's General Council to its section in French Switzerland, written by Marx, stated that, quite apart from the demands of international justice, it is an essential precondition for the emancipation of the English working class to transform the present enforced union, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, in other words, the enslavement of Ireland, into a free and equal confederation, if possible, and in total separation, if necessary. A footnote. The confidential communications discussion of Ireland was repeated almost verbatim in a letter of March 28, 1870 that Marx sent to Kugelmann for distribution to leaders of the German Social Democratic Workers' Party. End footnote. And on April 9th, 1870, Marx wrote to Siegfried Meyer and August Vogt that it was the special task of the IWMA's General Council to, quote, "make the English workers realise that for them the national emancipation of Ireland is not a question of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, but the first condition of their own social emancipation." This position raises a couple of questions. First, if Marx and the IWMA were so internationalist, then why were they so concerned with the working class of a single country, England? The answer is that, in Marx's view, the English working class was crucial because revolution in England was the linchpin of world revolution. He argued in the January 1st, 1870 confidential communication that England was not, quote, "simply a country along with other countries, but the metropolis of capital. A revolution in economic matters must immediately affect the whole world. Moreover, class antagonisms had become much more simplified in England. into a head-to-head antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat than they were elsewhere, and it was the only country in which working class struggle and organisation had acquired, quote, a certain degree of maturity and universality. Thus, quote, England alone can serve as a lever for a serious economic revolution, even though revolutionary initiative would probably come from France. This perspective has relevance today when the US is the metropolis of capital. An economic revolution in the US would have even more of an immediate effect on the whole world than a revolution in England would have had in Marx's day. Thus, while we certainly cannot pander to white nationalist sentiment within the so-called white working class, we must be concerned especially, but not exclusively, with the emancipatory self-development of the US working class, which is multiracial, ethnic and national, inasmuch as it is critical to world revolution. Irish immigration and xenophobia. Second, how could Marx argue that Irish independence was in the absolute interest of the English working class? He was keenly aware of the facts that seemed to suggest otherwise, facts rooted in Irish immigration to England. In a passage of his letter to Meyer and Vogt that is particularly salient in the light of today's struggles over immigration, Marx noted that because Irish peasants were being steadily evicted from the land and forced to emigrate, quote, Ireland constantly sends her own surplus population to the English labour market. And he argued that the constant oversupply of labour in England, quote, forces down wages and lowers the material and moral position of the English working class. As a result, quote, the ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life. But this hatred was not merely economic. It was shot through and through with prejudice, supremacist attitudes, and nationalistic identification with the English ruling class. Marx wrote, quote, in relation to the Irish worker, the ordinary English worker regards himself as a member of the ruling nation, and subsequently he becomes a tool of the English aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, thus strengthening their domination over himself. He cherishes religious, social and national prejudices against the Irish worker. His attitude towards him is much the same as that of the poor whites to the Negroes in the former slave states of the United States, USA. End of quote. Furthermore, the Irish masses returned the hatred. In both England and the US, where Fenianism was especially strong amongst Irish immigrants. Quote, the Irishman sees in the English worker both the accomplice and the stupid tool of the English rulers in Ireland. Thus every industrial and commercial centre in England now possesses a working class divided into two hostile camps, English proletarians and Irish proletarians. End quote. Footnote, all quotes in this and the preceding two paragraphs are from Marx's April the 9th, 1870 letter to Meyer and Vogt. Emphases are Marx's. The January the 1st, 1870 confidential communication with the IWMA's General Council contains a very similar analysis of the causes and effects of Irish immigration to England. End of footnote. Faced with similar facts today, prominent voices in the anti-neoliberal left want to quote, meet people where they are at. For example, the leader of the alleged left wing of Germany's Die Linke party, Sarah Wagenknecht, is, quote, trying to win over large chunks of working and middle class supporters of the AfD the Alternative für Deutschland, a racist, xenophobic far-right party. She favours limits on immigration into Germany and deportation of at least some immigrants convicted of crimes. And Jin Din, in his quest to, quote, build a mass socialist party, wants to win people over to regulated border policy on the grounds that support for, quote, fully open borders in the present context of economic insecurity cannot help but elicit a backlash. Workers who have seen their own standards undermined over time are not going to prioritise open borders, end quote. Freeing English workers from the leading strings of the ruling classes. Marx's attitude was the exact opposite. He did not compromise with xenophobia or anti-immigrant sentiment because his goal was the emancipatory self-development of the working class, not winning over a constituency to his party or programme. He focused unwaveringly on the actual world historic interests of the working class. He did not pander to the perceived interests or interest within capitalism of those elements of the working class whose existing opinions impeded the struggle for the freedom of every individual. In Marx's view, the nationalism and anti-Irish sentiment of much of the English working class were crucial impediments to that struggle. To overcome these impediments, English rule over Ireland needed to be ended. As long as the United Kingdom remained in existence, quote, the English people will remain tied to the leading strings of the ruling classes, because it will have to join with them in a common front against Ireland. Every one of its movements in England itself is crippled by the strife with the Irish. The metaphor of leading strings, strips of fabric attached to children's clothes, which adults held and used to restrain the children or help them walk, suggests that the nationalism of much of the English working class allowed the ruling classes to restrain and control them. Marx argued further that the English bourgeoisie consciously exploited and fomented nationalism and anti-Irish sentiment in order to stay in power. The January 1st, 1870 confidential IWMA communication stated that this antagonism between the two groups of proletarians, English and Irish, within England itself is artificially kept in being and fostered by the bourgeoisie, who know well that this split is the real secret of preserving their own power. And in his April 9th, 1870 letter to Meyer and Vogt, Marx wrote, quote, this antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, in short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling classes. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class, despite its organisation. It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, and the latter is quite aware of this, end quote. Marx's account identified two distinct sources of anti-Irish sentiment within the English working class. One was that competition from Irish immigrant workers was driving down their wages. The other was that the native English workers tended to look down upon Irish immigrants. As we've seen, Marx compared their typical attitude to the attitude of the, quote, the poor whites to the Negroes in the former slaves of the USA. Footnote, as in the US case, although to a lesser degree, the feeling of superiority had a material basis. Irish immigrants in England suffered from economic and social disadvantages and possibly residential segregation. They disproportionately lived in slums racked with disease, violence and alcohol abuse, and they tended to take the dirtiest, most dangerous and lowest paid jobs. A ballad at the top of the time stated that when work grew scarce and bread was dear and wages lessened too, the Irish hordes were bidders here, our half-paid work to do. Engels reiterated the analogy between native English workers and poor whites in the US in the May 14, 1872 meeting that Marx did not attend of the IWMA General Council. In a statement opposing a proposal to subsume Irish sections of the IWMA under the British Federal Council, Engels denounced it as analogous to, quote, members of a conquering nation calling upon the nation they had conquered and continued to hold down to forget their specific nationality and position, to sink national differences, and so forth. That is not internationalism. It is attempting to justify and to perpetuate the domination of the conqueror under the cloak of internationalism and sanctioning the belief only too common among the English working men that they were superior beings compared to the Irish, and as much an aristocracy as the mean whites of the slave states considered themselves to be with regard to the Negroes. End quote. The coincidence of these two sources of anti-Irish sentiment, job market competition and supremacist attitudes, is important. In the absence of supremacist thinking, Marx might conceivably have had favoured dealing with the job competition problem with a unite and fight working class strategy that overlooked national differences. For example, native English and immigrant Irish workers might have been able to join together to form unions in order to reduce competition between them and thereby relieve downward pressure on the wages of both groups. Footnote: given Marx's unwavering internationalism and his desire to free English workers from the leading strings of their ruling classes, support for immigration controls would still have been out of the question. His 1869-70 letters and confidential IWMA communications on Ireland implicitly put forward a quite different, revolutionary solution to the job competition problem. Irish independence would break the power of the absentee English landlords, whose evictions of Irish peasants from the land were a key cause of their migration to England and elsewhere. Earlier, Marx had opined that, quote, the characteristic features of Fenianism are socialistic tendencies in a negative sense, directed against the appropriation of the soil, and the fact that it is a movement of the lower orders. End of footnote. Accelerating the catastrophe of official England. In fact, Jacobin Seth Ackerman actually has the audacity to tell us that this is what Marx recommended. Footnote: after quoting the relevant section of Marx's letter to Meyer and Vogt, Ackerman sarcastically commented, quote, as a social theorist, Marx unfortunately lacked the subtlety of, say, a Hillary Clinton, who said that racial inequality is not merely a symptom of economic equality. His reductionist solution was for the Irish to free themselves from their English landlords in Ireland and unite with the English workers in England. End of footnote. But not only does Marx's text say nothing about the Irish, quote, uniting with the English workers in England, what it does say makes clear that it would have been ludicrous to try to implement the class reductionist and economistic perspective favoured by Ackerman. Owing to anti-Irish prejudice within the English working class and the subsequent antagonism between English and Irish workers, any, quote, sink national differences, unite and fight strategy was simply untenable. In her response to Ackerman, Jennifer Roche, a member of the International Socialist Organization, US, recognized that he, quote, missed the entire thrust of Marx's argument. But she missed it as well, writing that Marx was, quote, calling for the English worker to overcome his artificial antagonism in order to make a united working class movement possible. This reading is almost as unrooted as in the text as Ackerman's is. Marx had come to the conclusion that as long as English rule over Ireland persisted, appeals for unity, such as the one that Roche put into his mouth, were abstract and futile. As he wrote to Engels on December 11, 1869, quote, "For a long time I believed that it would be possible to overthrow the Irish regime by English working class ascendancy. Deeper study has now convinced me of the opposite. The English working class will never accomplish anything before it has got rid of Ireland. The lever must be applied in Ireland." End quote. Footnote. Marx's November 29, 1869 letter to Kugelmann similarly argued that, quote, the English working class can never do anything decisive here in England, as long as England continued to rule over Ireland. End of footnote. Marx's letter to Engels does not explain how he came to this conclusion. However, his letter to Kugelmann, written 12 days earlier, states that unless and until Ireland was freed from English rule, quote, the English people will have to join with their ruling classes in a common front against Ireland, and they will therefore, quote, remain tied to the leading strings of the Irish ruling classes. And they will therefore, quote, remain tied to the leading strings of the ruling classes. Footnote. Extant texts seem to contain no direct explanation for why Marx thought that English workers were being compelled to take to the side of their ruling classes, but the most likely explanation is that job market competition objectively pitted English workers against Irish immigrants. End of footnote. Marx therefore eschewed empty appeals to English workers to overcome their anti-Irish prejudice that failed to confront the objective conditions that engendered the prejudice. What he actually called for to change the objective situation was the defeat of England in its struggle with Ireland. Quote, "It is the most important object of the International Working Men's Association to hasten the social revolution in Ireland. The sole means of hastening it is to make Ireland independent. Hence, it is the task of the International everywhere to put the conflict between England and Ireland in the foreground, and everywhere to side openly with Ireland." End quote. Quote, "To accelerate the social development in Europe, you must push on. Accelerate the catastrophe of official England. To do so, you must attack her in Ireland. That's her weakest point. Ireland lost. The British Empire is gone, and a class war in England, till now somnolent and chronic, will assume acute forms." End quote. Thus, in Marx's view, it was futile to appeal to English workers to overcome their hostility to their Irish counterparts, unless that appeal was tied tightly to the defeat of England. Only England's defeat would deflate their supremacist pretensions, free them from identifying their interests with those of the English ruling classes, and put them on an independent, internationalist and emancipatory path. Footnote. When it was tied tightly to the defeat of England, Marx did of course favour and participate in activity to lessen anti-Irish prejudices. In October 1869, the IWMA General Council helped to organise a mass Justice for Ireland demonstration in London, that called for amnesty for Irish political prisoners. According to the General Council minutes of October the 26th, Marx said that the main feature of the demonstration was that, quote, at least part of the English working class has lost their prejudice against the Irish. End of footnote. With the rise of the far-right xenophobic nationalism, we face a somewhat similar situation today. While much of the anti-neoliberal left was muting its opposition to Trump, if not indeed enabling his victory, on the grounds that he enjoyed strong support from some of the white working class, MHI warned that there was no greater obstacle to emancipatory self-activity from below than politicians like Trump, who pit working people one against the other in order to divide and conquer them and strive to make them his followers. Only the defeat of Trumpism can deflate the supremacist pretensions of Trump's white nationalist base, free it from his leading strings, and reorientate it towards genuinely independent, i.e. that is anti-racist, internationalist, emancipatory self-activity. The impact of the US Civil War on emancipatory working class self-activity. Marx, as well as Engels, closely followed and wrote extensively about the US Civil War. Their writings on the war consist largely of battle reports, discussions of military strategy and tactics, and analyses of changes in the political situation in the North. But various other topics were also taken up. Raya Dunskai's commentary in Chapter 5 of her book, Marxism and Freedom, remains important for highlighting Marx's support for and engagement with the abolitionist movement and the changes that he made to his book, Capital, under the impact of the Civil War. Here, we will focus on what can be learned from these writings about white nationalism and how to combat it. We can be fairly brief. Marx supported the North in the Civil War, not only in his writings but in organisational activity as well. He helped to organise a March 1863 meeting sponsored by the London Trade Unions Council and attended by as many as 3,000 people that successfully opposed Britain's entrance into the war on behalf of the South. The English Union leaders involved in organising that meeting went on to join with Marx in founding the IWMA 18 months later. His support for the North was unwavering, even though he was well aware that it was by no means pure. In an October the 11th, 1861 article in the New York Daily Tribune, Marx discussed bourgeois London publications that took the opposite tack. They, quote, affected an utter horror of slavery, but took a, quote, hostile tone against the North and harboured ill-concealed sympathies with the South. For example, he quoted complaints in The Economist that abolitionists had been mistreated in the North and that the US government had impeded efforts to end the international slave trade, which was mainly financed and operated by Northerners. Marx did not dispute these facts. Instead, he exposed what would today be called the whataboutism of The Economist. Quote, the necessity of justifying its attitude by such pettifogging Old Bailey pleas, proves more than anything else that the anti-Northern part of the English press is instigated by hidden motives, too mean and dastardly to be openly avowed. There is an unmistakable parallel to this today, when the anti-neoliberal left spends its time railing endlessly against the impurity of Hillary Clinton, centrists and liberals, while letting Trump and Trumpism off the hook by dismissing them as a distraction. Does this whataboutism hide motives that they choose not to avow openly? Marx's overriding reason for supporting the North, despite its checkered past, is that he was convinced that its victory would put an end to slavery in the US. That fact, which is obvious now, was not so obvious then. The North's original aim in the war was not to free the slaves, but to preserve the Union, and Lincoln did not emancipate the slaves in the South until the middle of the war. However, Marx anticipated that the war would result in the abolition of slavery, in part because the North would probably have had to free slaves in order to defeat the South. In a May 6, 1861 letter to Lyon Phillips, he predicted the ultimate victory of the North. Quote, "Since if the need arises, it has a last card up its sleeve in the shape of the slave rebellion." In an August 7, 1862 letter to Engels, Marx attributed the North's early difficulties in the war to the fact that it was focused on preserving the Union, not ending slavery. Quote, "Wars of this kind ought to be conducted along revolutionary lines, and the Yankees have so far been trying to conduct it along constitutional ones." But he predicted that, quote, "the North will, at last, wage the war in earnest, have course to revolutionary methods, and overthrow the supremacy of the border slave statesmen. One single N-word regiment would have a remarkable effect on Southern nerves." Footnote: after the Emancipation Proclamation was announced, the North did begin to recruit blacks to the military, and in May 1863 it established the Bureau of Colored Troops. By the end of the war, almost 200,000 blacks served in the Northern Army and Navy. End of footnote. On September the 22nd, Lincoln announced his intention to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. In an article published by Die Presse on October the 12th, Marx wrote that this, quote, "proclamation is the most important document in American history since the establishment of the Union, tantamount to tearing up of the old American Constitution." Grounds of Marx's anti-slavery activity. Why was the abolition of slavery so important to Marx? He was, of course, staunchly opposed to it on humanitarian grounds. He wrote in Capital that a world market for Southern cotton had led to the overworking of the Negro, and sometimes the using up of his life in 7 years of labor became a factor in a calculating system in which, quote, "the civilized horrors of overwork were grafted on the barbaric horrors of slavery." However, just as in the case of Irish independence, Marx's concern was not solely humanitarian. He was also doing what he could do to accelerate the, quote, "independent movement of the workers, white as well as black, and internationally as well as in the US. He considered the abolition of slavery, and thus victory for the North, to be in the interest of the whole working class. For instance, when Lincoln was re-elected president in 1864, Marx wrote a congratulatory address to him on behalf of the IWMA, which stated, quote, "The working men of Europe feel sure that as the American War of Independence initiated a new era of ascendancy for the middle class, so the American anti-slavery war will do for the working class." In the same address, Marx wrote, quote, "While the working men, the true political powers of the North, allow slavery to defile their own republic, while before the Negro, mastered and sold without his concurrence, they boasted it the highest prerogative of the white-skinned labourer to sell himself and choose his own master, they were unable to attain the true freedom of labour, or to support their European brethren in their struggle for emancipation. But this barrier to progress has been swept off by the Red Sea of civil war." End quote. A lot of ideas are packed into this sentence. Marx criticizes white workers for allowing slavery to defile their own republic. Marx criticizes white workers for allowing slavery to, quote, "defile their own republic," and for prizing their privileged status vis-à-vis black slaves. He also criticizes them for their lack of solidarity with European workers. He characterizes their attitude to the slaves and slavery as a, quote, "barrier to progress," not only to the progress of the slaves, but to their own progress as well, since their attitude prevented them from, quote, "attaining the true freedom of labour." An apparent euphemism for a classless socialist society. And finally, he hails the actions of the North in the Civil War for having swept away this barrier to progress. Here again, then, Marx focuses on the actual world historic interests of the working class. He did not take his cue from the perceived interests of elements of the working class whose existing opinions were barriers to their own progress. And just as he would soon champion the Irish struggle for independence because of its potential to deal a blow against the supremacist attitudes of English workers that diverted them from the revolutionary internationalist path, he here championed the North's war against slavery for its potential to deal a blow against the supremacist attitudes that diverted the white working class of the United States. A few years later, Marx iterated the same idea in a famous passage in Capital. Quote, "In the United States of North America, every independent movement of the workers was paralyzed so long as slavery disfigured a part of the Republic. Labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin, where in the black it is branded." Taken by itself, this latter statement is somewhat vague. Marx does not spell out why labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin, where in the black it is branded. When read together with the address to Lincoln, however, it becomes clear that Marx is suggesting that supremacist thinking and acceptance of slavery among elements of the white working class of the US caused them to, quote, "forge their own chains." The January 1st, 1870 confidential communication from the IWMA's General Council would later express a similar thought regarding the attitudes of the English masses to the Irish. Quote, "What ancient Rome demonstrated on a giant scale can be seen in the England of today. A people which subjugates another people forges its own chains." But when Marx made the statement about labor in the white and black skins, the slaves were already free and the North had won the Civil War. He noted with approval that these events had begun to undo the paralysis of the working class movement. Quote, "But out of the death of slavery, a new life at once arose. The first fruit of the Civil War was the 8 hours agitation. That is, agitation for the workday to be legally limited to 8 hours. That ran with the 7-leagued boots of the locomotive from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from New England to California." A May 12, 1869 address of the IWMA to the National Labor Union in the US, written by Marx, reiterated this point as follows, quote, "The victorious termination of the anti-slavery war has opened a new epoch in the annals of the working class. In the states themselves, an independent working class movement, looked upon with an evil eye by your old parties and their professional politicians, has since that date sprung to life. On you, then, depends the glorious task to prove to the world that now at last the working classes are bestriding the scene of history, no longer as servile retainers, but as independent actors, conscious of their own responsibility and able to command peace where their would-be masters shout war." End quote. Footnote. The comment about war and peace is part of the address's call on the National Labor Union to try to help prevent a war between the US and the United Kingdom. End of quote. Conclusion. Compromises with white nationalism, disregard for its dangers, and abstract rhetoric about interracial and international unity are not solutions. They have contributed to the crisis we now face. The time is now to reclaim the revolutionary humanism of Marx's struggle against white nationalism. We must decisively defeat Trumpism and other manifestations of far-right xenophobia and racism, and soon. Their defeat is in the interest of all humanity. Not least, it is in the interests of the white nationalist base that Trump has in his grip. Only the defeat of Trumpism can free it from his grip and help redirect it away from white nationalism and onto the path of independent emancipatory self-activity.
My name is Ravi Bali. This is the founding statement of MHI, Who We Are. Marxist-Humanist Initiative, MHI, began in April 2009 following the collapse of previous Marxist-Humanist organisations. It aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing and concretising the philosophy of Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, and its further development in the Marxist-Humanism articulated by Raya Denevskaya, 1910 to 1987. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses who will form their own organisations and whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organisation in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marx's philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Today's economic crisis and recession present a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses, which do not merely assert but demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of value. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not socialism. MHI's ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements of African Americans and other minorities, women, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. To this end, we open our website to the widest possible dialogue with people around the world. We intend to practice, as well as espouse, a two-way road between our organisation and people outside it, as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice, and as a way to ensure the survival of Marxist-Humanism. Our collective is working to create an organisation so firmly rooted in its philosophy that it will not succumb to diversions that may arise from personal agendas, and that will be capable of developing and concretising that philosophy over the long haul, regardless of who its members may be. It is no simple matter to create a democratic organisation, but is at the same time effective and able to resist efforts to divert it from its goals. We are aware that Marx never achieved an organisation based on his philosophy, and that Dönitsch's organisation disintegrated following her death. But we have made progress on this matter, with our principles and bylaws, and by recognising that Marxist-Humanism cannot be carried on by chance or by individuals alone. An organisation is needed to test and prove ideas. We invite you all to join us in this discussion and initiative.